Black flags hung limp from balconies, marking the houses where entire families had been wiped out. The only sounds were the distant cries of mourning and the incessant tolling of church bells. It seemed as if Siena itself had been abandoned by God. Giovanni wiped the sweat from his brow, though the cool autumn air did little to ease the heat of exhaustion that pulsed through his veins. The small room he used as a makeshift clinic was packed with the sick and dying. No matter how many remedies he administered, how many desperate prayers he whispered under his breath, it was never enough. He had lost count of the number of patients he had watched slip away in front of him, their eyes wide with fear, their bodies convulsing as the plague claimed them. He stood, shaking his head in frustration. He had been taught that science could solve any problem, but this was something else entirely. The Black Death showed no mercy. It swept through the city, cutting down rich and poor alike. Giovanni had once believed that reason would prevail, that if he only worked harder, thought smarter, he could save them. But now he wasn't so sure. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door creaking open. Father Pietro shuffled in, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. The priest's once vibrant eyes had faded with age, and his face, drawn and pale, betrayed the burden of sleepless nights and countless last rites. Father Pietro, Giovanni greeted him with a curt nod, returning to his patient, a boy of no more than 12, his body racked with fever. "Giovanni," Father Pietro replied, his voice raspy and low. He took a seat by the door, watching Giovanni work with an expression that hovered somewhere between pity and fear. "You cannot keep this pace forever. Even a man of science must acknowledge his limits." Giovanni's hand hesitated over the boy's fevered brow. "If I stop, they die," he muttered. "They die regardless," Father Pietro whispered. Silence fell between them, thick and heavy with the weight of truth. After a moment, Father Pietro cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. "Giovanni, there is something you must know." The doctor didn't look up, focusing instead on the boy's shallow breathing. "If this is another plea to trust in divine intervention, I've no time for it, Father." "No, Giovanni. This is different." Pietro leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There is an old story, one few in Siena remember. It was a time much like this, centuries ago, when plague swept through the land. But Siena was spared." Giovanni paused, finally turning his gaze to the priest. "Spared? By what means?" Father Pietro's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Giovanni thought he saw a flicker of fear cross the old man's face. "There was a ritual," Pietro said softly. "A forbidden act, an offering, some say, to forces that dwell beneath the city." Giovanni's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about? Superstitions? Folktales?" "No, not superstitions," Pietro insisted. "It happened. The rulers of Siena, they made a pact with dark powers. It saved the city once, but at a cost." Giovanni shook his head. "And now you believe we should do the same? You want to make a deal with devils to spare Siena?" "I don't want anything," Pietro said hoarsely. "But others have already begun the preparations." A chill ran down Giovanni's spine, despite the warmth of the crowded room. He could see the desperation in Father Pietro's eyes, and it echoed the same hopelessness that gnawed at his own heart. "Their faith is misplaced," Giovanni said quietly. "There are no forces that can stop this plague. Only our wits and our hands can save us." Pietro stood slowly, leaning heavily on his cane. He stared at Giovanni for a long moment, his eyes filled with sadness. "Be careful, my son. You are not the first to think so, nor will you be the last to pay the price for such beliefs." With that, the old priest turned and hobbled out of the room, leaving Giovanni alone with his thoughts and the dying child at his feet. The distant tolling of the bells seemed louder than before, echoing in his mind long after the priest had gone. The crypt was colder than Giovanni expected, and the stench of damp stone mixed with the faint, nauseating smell of decay. He had never ventured into the lower levels of Siena's cathedral before, but the rumors he had heard from Father Pietro left him little choice. If there was even a fragment of truth to what the priest had said, he had to see it for himself. Giovanni descended the narrow staircase, his footsteps echoing off the walls. The air grew heavier as he went deeper into the earth, his breath coming out in shallow puffs as if the darkness itself was pressing in on him. His heart raced, not from exertion, but from the creeping sense of dread that settled into his bones. The crypt had been sealed off for years, yet now there were whispers among the clergy of strange activities, of meetings held in the dead of night. His rational mind tried to dismiss it all as superstition, but with each step, his doubts grew. At the bottom of the stairs, he found an old iron door, half rusted and slick with moisture. Giovanni hesitated, his hand resting on the latch. Was he truly prepared to see what lay beyond? A part of him wanted to turn back, to pretend none of this existed, to return to the safety of his medical studies and the comfort of logic. But another part, the part that had been broken by the countless deaths he had witnessed, drove him forward. He pushed open the door. The chamber beyond was lit by a faint, flickering light. Rows of candles lined the walls, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the ancient stone. The walls were adorned with faded murals, depictions of saints and angels, their faces worn down by time. But beneath the layers of holy imagery, something darker had been carved into the stone, twisted figures and strange symbols that Giovanni could not decipher. The sight of them made his stomach turn. And then he saw them. At the far end of the chamber, a group of figures stood in a circle, their heads bowed, their faces obscured by hooded cloaks. In the center of the circle lay a stone altar, slick with fresh blood. Giovanni's breath caught in his throat. He had arrived in the midst of a ritual, a forbidden ceremony carried out in the hidden depths of Siena. He stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to get closer to see what they were doing. But the moment he moved, one of the figures turned toward him. Giovanni froze, his pulse racing as the figure's gaze met his. The hooded figure stepped forward, and Giovanni recognized him instantly. It was Lorenzo, one of Siena's most powerful nobles, a man who held sway over the city's council, a man whose wealth and influence were unmatched. Giovanni had known him as a patron of the arts, a generous benefactor of the city. But here, in the dim light of the crypt, Lorenzo's true nature was revealed. "Giovanni," Lorenzo said softly, his voice carrying an unnatural calmness. "I had hoped you would not find your way here." Giovanni swallowed hard, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "What is this?" he demanded, though he already knew the answer. Lorenzo smiled, a cold, empty smile that sent a shiver down Giovanni's spine. "This," he said, gesturing to the altar, "is the price we pay to save Siena." Giovanni's eyes flicked to the blood-stained stone, and his stomach churned with revulsion. "Human sacrifice? You think this will stop the plague?" Lorenzo's expression did not change. "It has worked before. It will work again." The other cloaked figures remained silent, their heads bowed in reverence or perhaps in shame. Giovanni could not tell. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This was madness, a barbaric relic of a time long past. He had spent years studying medicine, learning to heal with knowledge and science, and now he was faced with this, superstition and bloodshed masquerading as salvation. "You're all insane," Giovanni whispered, his voice barely audible. This is not salvation. This is murder." Lorenzo's smile faded, his expression hardening. "You may think that, Giovanni. But when the city is saved, when the plague subsides, you will see the truth. Sometimes, the price of survival is higher than we wish to pay. But it must be paid nonetheless." Giovanni took a step back, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He wanted to run, to escape this place, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. He stared at Lorenzo, at the cold detachment in his eyes, and for the first time, he understood the depth of the power this man held. It was not just political or financial, it was something far darker, something that reached beyond the mortal realm. "I won't let this continue," Giovanni said, his voice shaking but determined. "This isn't the way." Lorenzo regarded him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Perhaps not for you," he said. "But for Siena, it is the only way." Giovanni's hands trembled as he backed away toward the door, his eyes never leaving Lorenzo's face. He knew then that he was standing on the edge of something far greater than he had ever imagined. And the choice before him was not as simple as life and death. It was the choice between saving Siena's soul or damning it forever. Giovanni sat in his small study, surrounded by piles of old manuscripts and dusty tomes. His mind raced, filled with the images of what he had witnessed in the crypt, the blood-soaked altar, the hooded figures, and the cold, unwavering eyes of Lorenzo. The scent of old parchment and ink mingled with the faint scent of herbs from Beatrice's satchel, but none of it brought him the comfort it once had. Everything he thought he knew about Siena, about salvation, had been shattered in that underground chamber. He sifted through the manuscripts, searching for answers. Father Pietro had mentioned that Siena had been saved from plague once before, centuries ago. Somewhere, in the city's forgotten history, there had to be a record of this dark ritual, of the pact that had spared Siena. But the more Giovanni read, the less sense it all made. The texts were vague, filled with religious allegory and superstition. Nothing concrete, nothing that could help him understand the full scope of what he was facing. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and Giovanni's heart skipped a beat. He half expected to see Lorenzo standing there, come to silence him for what he had witnessed. But when he opened the door, it was only Beatrice, her face pale and drawn, dark circles under her eyes betraying her own exhaustion. "You look as though you haven't slept in days," she said softly as she stepped inside, her eyes scanning the cluttered room. "What are you searching for?" Giovanni gestured to the pile of manuscripts with a frustrated sigh. "Answers," he said. "Father Pietro told me that Siena was saved once before, during a time like this. He said there was a pact, a ritual that spared the city. I need to know if it's true." Beatrice's expression tightened as she looked at him, a mixture of fear and disbelief in her eyes. "You don't mean to say you believe him, do you? These are just old wives' tales, stories told to keep the people in line." Giovanni shook his head. "I've seen it with my own eyes, Beatrice. There is a cult beneath the city. They're performing rituals, sacrifices. They believe they can stop the plague." Beatrice recoiled slightly, her hand instinctively moving to her chest as if to ward off evil. "That's madness, Giovanni. You can't be serious." "I wish I wasn't," Giovanni replied, his voice low. "But this is real. I've seen it. And it's worse than we ever imagined." Beatrice moved to the window, staring out into the desolate street beyond. The city was a ghost of what it once had been. The plague had stripped Siena of its beauty, leaving only shadows and despair in its wake. She let out a long breath, her fingers tracing the edges of the window pane. "What do you intend to do?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to know if this has happened before," Giovanni said, turning back to the manuscripts. "And if it worked, if they really managed to stave off the plague with these rituals. If I can find that out, maybe I can figure out a way to stop it." Beatrice shook her head, her eyes filled with sorrow. "And what if it's true? What if they did save Siena? Would you condemn the city by stopping them?" Giovanni's breath caught in his throat. It was a question he had been avoiding, one he didn't want to face. What if the rituals did work? What if the price of survival was human sacrifice, the blood of the innocent spilled on ancient stones to appease some dark force that lurked beneath the city? "No," he said firmly, though his voice wavered slightly. "I won't accept that. There has to be another way." Beatrice turned back to him, her expression softening. "Perhaps," she said gently. "But be careful, Giovanni. There are some truths that are better left buried. If you continue down this path, you may not like what you find." Giovanni met her gaze, a deep sadness reflected in her eyes. He knew she was right. The path he was on was dangerous, both for him and for Siena. But he couldn't turn back now. Not after what he had seen. He had to know the truth, even if it meant confronting the darkness that lay hidden beneath the city's ancient stones. "I don't have a choice," Giovanni whispered, more to himself than to Beatrice. She nodded solemnly. "Then may God be with you," she said quietly, and with that, she turned and left the room, leaving Giovanni alone once more with his thoughts and the shadows of Siena's past. Giovanni had never been a man of superstition. His belief in science and reason had carried him through the horrors of the plague, giving him a purpose when all else seemed lost. But now, as he stood in the grand hall of Lorenzo's palazzo, he felt those beliefs slipping away like sand through his fingers. Lorenzo sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by men and women of Siena's highest social ranks. Their faces were calm, their eyes filled with a quiet confidence that Giovanni couldn't comprehend. How could they remain so composed when the rest of the city was being consumed by death? How could they participate in such monstrous rituals and believe they were doing good? Giovanni clenched his fists at his sides, feeling the heat rise in his chest as he stared at Lorenzo. The nobleman was dressed impeccably, as always, his every movement exuding the grace and poise of a man who had never known hardship. But there was something else in his gaze now, something darker, colder, like a shadow lurking just behind his eyes. "Why have you summoned me here?" Giovanni asked, his voice tight with barely restrained anger. Lorenzo took a sip of wine before setting the goblet down with a deliberate slowness. He smiled, a smile that Giovanni had once found charming, but now saw as nothing more than a mask. "I thought it was time we had a conversation," Lorenzo said, his tone light, as though they were discussing the weather. "You've been making quite the stir lately, Giovanni. Stirring up old ghosts, digging where you shouldn't. It worries some of the others. They think you might disrupt our efforts." "Disrupt your efforts?" Giovanni repeated incredulously. "You're killing people in secret ceremonies. What exactly do you think you're saving?" Lorenzo's smile didn't falter, but the amusement in his eyes dimmed. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a lower, more serious tone. "We are saving Siena, Giovanni. You've seen the devastation. You know better than most the toll this plague has taken. What we do here, in this room, is the only thing keeping Siena from falling completely into ruin." Giovanni took a step closer, his fists still clenched. "You're deluding yourselves," he spat. "This plague doesn't choose who it strikes, it takes the good and the wicked alike. You think spilling blood in the name of some ancient ritual will stop it? You're mad." Lorenzo studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stood, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the hall. "It may seem mad to you, Giovanni, but history has proven otherwise. There are forces at work in this world that your science cannot explain. Forces that can be harnessed for the right price." Giovanni's stomach twisted at the words. He had heard enough from Father Pietro to understand the nature of these forces. Dark powers that fed on death and suffering, entities older than civilization itself. The thought of them being invoked to save Siena filled him with revulsion. "You're playing with something you don't understand," Giovanni said, his voice quieter now, but no less determined. "If you continue down this path, it will destroy us all." Lorenzo sighed, almost as if he pitied Giovanni. "Perhaps," he said softly, "but there is no other way. You, of all people, should know that." Giovanni shook his head, his thoughts racing. He had come here hoping to confront Lorenzo, to expose the truth of what was happening beneath the city. But now, faced with the calm certainty of the man in front of him, Giovanni felt something crack inside him. What if Lorenzo was right? What if there was no other way? Lorenzo took a step closer to Giovanni, his voice softening. "Join us, Giovanni. You're a man of influence, of reason. You could help us, guide us in these dark times. You could have a place at this table, a voice in how we save this city." Giovanni felt his heart pounding in his chest. The offer hung in the air like a blade over his head. He could refuse, walk away from all of this and return to his work as a physician, fighting the plague with everything he had left. Or he could accept the offer, become part of this dark ritual, and try to use his influence to change things from the inside. Perhaps he could mitigate the damage, find a way to lessen the sacrifices. Perhaps, in the end, he could still save Siena. But at what cost? "I will not join you," Giovanni said finally, his voice resolute despite the doubt gnawing at him. "Whatever power you think you control, it will consume you. And I will not be part of it." Lorenzo's eyes darkened, the brief moment of camaraderie vanishing like smoke. He stepped back, his expression cold once more. "So be it," he said quietly. "But know this, Giovanni, You are now an enemy of the very forces that could save Siena. And they do not forgive easily." Giovanni turned on his heel and walked out of the palazzo, the weight of Lorenzo's words heavy on his shoulders. The choice had been made, but the consequences were only just beginning to unfold. The entrance to the catacombs was hidden behind a thick tapestry in one of Siena's oldest churches. It had been forgotten by most of the clergy, left to rot and collapse with the passage of time, but Giovanni knew better now. Father Pietro had reluctantly revealed the location, his voice heavy with regret as he warned Giovanni of the horrors that lay within. But Giovanni had no choice. If he was to stop the ritual, he had to see the depths of this dark secret for himself. Beatrice stood beside him at the church's entrance, her face pale and drawn. She clutched a small vial of holy water around her neck, her fingers trembling slightly as they hovered over the sacred object. Giovanni could see the conflict in her eyes. She had always been devout, her faith guiding her through the darkest days of the plague. But now, that faith was crumbling, replaced by fear and uncertainty. "Are you certain you want to do this?" Giovanni asked, his voice soft, though he knew the answer already. Beatrice swallowed hard and nodded. "I need to understand," she whispered. "I need to see the truth with my own eyes." Together, they pushed aside the tapestry and descended into the dark, narrow stairwell that led into the catacombs. The air grew colder with each step, the dampness seeping into their skin and chilling them to the bone. The sound of dripping water echoed through the tunnel, mixing with the faint rustle of unseen creatures that skittered away at the sound of their approach. Giovanni held a lantern in one hand, its weak light casting long shadows on the walls as they moved deeper underground. The walls were lined with ancient bones, stacked neatly in rows, a silent testament to the countless lives that had ended in Siena's long and violent history. Beatrice recoiled slightly at the sight, but she pressed on, her jaw set in determination. "We're almost there," Giovanni murmured as they reached a narrow passageway that split off from the main tunnel. He could feel it, an oppressive, almost malevolent presence lingering in the air, growing stronger with each step. They turned a corner, and suddenly the passage opened up into a vast, open chamber. It was larger than Giovanni had expected, the ceiling towering above them, the stone walls lined with strange carvings that glowed faintly in the dim light of the lantern. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, slick with blood, just as he had seen in the ritual before. The stench of death was overpowering here, thick and nauseating, and Beatrice covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with horror. This is where they do it," Giovanni said, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own heartbeat. "This is where they make their sacrifices." Beatrice took a step forward, her hand dropping from her mouth as she approached the altar. She reached out with trembling fingers, tracing the blood-stained surface, her face pale and stricken. "All those people," she whispered, her voice breaking. "All of them offered to." She stopped abruptly, her eyes darting toward the far end of the chamber. Giovanni followed her gaze, his heart racing as he saw what had caught her attention. There, in the shadows, was a figure, a man, half hidden by the darkness, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Giovanni stepped in front of Beatrice, his body tense. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. The figure stepped forward into the light, and Giovanni's breath caught in his throat. It was one of the cloaked figures from the ritual, the same man he had seen only days before, his face now partially revealed beneath the hood. His eyes were hollow, sunken, his skin pale and gaunt, as though he had not seen the sun in years. "You shouldn't be here," the man rasped, his voice low and ragged. "You don't understand what you're meddling with." Giovanni took a step closer, refusing to back down. "I understand enough. You think you can save Siena with this madness? It's killing the city, not saving it." The man's hollow eyes flicked to the altar, then back to Giovanni. "The plague cannot be stopped with medicine or prayer. Only the old ways can hold it at bay. You will see, in time, you will see." Giovanni clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. "No, I will not let this continue." The man's gaze shifted to Beatrice, and a slow, unsettling smile spread across his lips. It's too late to stop it. The pact has already been made. The blood of Siena will continue to flow until the city is safe. Beatrice gasped, her hand tightening around the vial of holy water as she took a step back. No, she whispered, shaking her head. This can't be. There must be another way. But the man only laughed, a hollow, empty sound that echoed through the chamber. There is no other way, he said softly. Only blood will save us now. Giovanni felt a wave of nausea wash over him, but he refused to give in to despair. He turned to Beatrice, his voice firm. We have to leave. We have to stop them. She nodded weakly, her eyes filled with tears as they turned and fled back into the dark tunnels, the sound of the man's hollow laughter echoing behind them like a specter that would haunt them forever. The streets of Siena had grown quieter in the days since Giovanni's descent into the catacombs, the shadows longer, the air heavier with the unspoken fear that gripped the city. It was as if the very soul of Siena was teetering on the edge of oblivion, waiting for some unseen force to pull it into the abyss. Giovanni had barely slept since returning from the catacombs. The images of the blood-stained altar and the hollow-eyed man haunted him relentlessly, his mind replaying their encounter in endless loops. He could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on him, a burden too heavy to bear alone. He sat in his study, staring blankly at the scattered manuscripts before him. He had combed through the ancient texts again and again, searching for a way to stop the ritual, to break the dark pact that had been made. But the more he searched, the more hopeless the task seemed. The old ways, as the man in the catacombs had called them, were rooted deep in Siena's history, long before Giovanni had even been born. A soft knock at the door broke his reverie. Giovanni stood slowly, his body aching from exhaustion, and opened the door to find Father Pietro standing in the dim light of the hallway. The old priest's face was drawn, his eyes filled with a sadness that Giovanni had come to recognize all too well. Giovanni, Father Pietro said softly, stepping inside the small room. I have heard troubling things. I fear you are digging too deeply into matters that are best left untouched. Giovanni closed the door and turned to face the priest, his eyes narrowing. You told me where to find the catacombs, he said, his voice tight. You led me to the truth. Why warn me now? Father Pietro sighed, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his years. I hoped that you would find a way to stop it, but I see now that the forces at play are far beyond any of us. Giovanni's brow furrowed. You're telling me to stop? After everything I've seen? After everything I've learned? No, Father. I can't stop. I won't. The old priest lowered his gaze, his hands trembling slightly as he clasped them together. You don't understand, he whispered, his voice barely audible. There are powers in this world that should not be disturbed. Powers that can destroy us all if we are not careful. Giovanni took a step closer, his heart pounding in his chest. What do you mean? He asked, his voice filled with suspicion. What haven't you told me? Father Pietro looked up slowly, his eyes filled with guilt and fear. I didn't want to believe it, he said softly. But now I see that there is no other way. The ritual, it must continue. Giovanni's blood ran cold at the words, his mind racing to comprehend what the priest was saying. You're part of it, he whispered, the realization hitting him like a blow to the chest. You're part of the cult. Father Pietro winced at the accusation, but he did not deny it. I never wanted this, he said quietly. But the pact was made long ago. I had no choice. Giovanni's hands shook with anger as he stepped closer, his voice rising. No choice? You're telling me you had no choice but to sacrifice innocent lives? To spill blood in the name of some ancient darkness? How could you? Father Pietro bowed his head, tears welling in his eyes. I did it to protect Siena, he whispered. I did it to save our city. Giovanni's heart pounded in his chest, his mind reeling from the betrayal. The man he had once trusted, the man who had guided him through the darkest days of the plague, was nothing more than a pawn in the hands of the very forces he had been trying to fight. He felt a surge of anger and disgust rise within him, but before he could speak, There was a loud crash from the hallway outside. Giovanni turned sharply, his heart leaping into his throat as the door burst open and several men entered the room, cloaked figures, their faces hidden in shadow. Lorenzo stepped forward, his calm and composed demeanor intact even in the face of the chaos. "I warned you, Giovanni," he said softly, his eyes cold and emotionless. "I told you not to meddle." Giovanni took a step back, his hands clenched into fists. "I'm not afraid of you, Lorenzo," he spat. "I know what you're doing, and I won't let it continue." Lorenzo smiled faintly, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous light. "You should have left well enough alone," he said. "But now you've left us no choice." The cloaked men surged forward, grabbing Giovanni by the arms and forcing him to his knees. He struggled against them, but their grip was like iron, unyielding and unbreakable. He looked up at Father Pietro, betrayal and fury burning in his eyes. "How could you?" Giovanni whispered, his voice filled with despair. "I trusted you." Father Pietro turned away, his shoulders trembling with silent sobs. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I never wanted this." But Giovanni's anger was too great to be calmed by the priest's regret. He had been betrayed by those he thought were on his side, and now he was at the mercy of the very cult he had sworn to destroy. Lorenzo stepped closer, his voice calm and measured. "Take him to the catacombs," he ordered. "The ritual must continue. And this time, he will be part of it." As the cloaked men dragged Giovanni toward the door, he felt a cold knot of fear tighten in his chest. But even as they pulled him into the dark, narrow hallway, his mind raced with a single thought, a desperate plan that might just be his last chance to stop the cult and save Siena from the darkness that threatened to consume it. The catacombs were colder than Giovanni remembered, the air thick with dampness and the scent of decay. His wrists ached from the rough ropes that bound them, and every step sent sharp pain shooting up his legs as the cloaked men dragged him deeper into the underground labyrinth. Their silent procession echoed through the narrow tunnels, the sound of their footsteps bouncing off the stone walls like the beating of a drum. Giovanni kept his head down, focusing on his breathing, willing his heart to slow. Panic would not serve him here. He had to think, had to find a way out before the ritual began. He had to destroy the catacombs, collapse them, and sever the dark forces' hold over Siena. But how? As they approached the chamber where he had first witnessed the ritual, Giovanni's mind raced with possible plans. The structure of the catacombs was old, fragile. If he could trigger a collapse, it might bury the cult, the altar, and whatever malevolent entity they were feeding. It would be dangerous, and he knew that if he succeeded, he might not make it out alive. But the alternative was unthinkable. They entered the chamber, and the sight of the altar sent a wave of nausea through Giovanni. The stone was slick with fresh blood, and the strange carvings on the walls seemed to pulse with a dim, unnatural light. The figures from the last ritual were already gathered, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. Lorenzo stood at the center, his eyes gleaming with the same unsettling calmness that Giovanni had come to despise. "Giovanni," Lorenzo said softly, stepping forward. "You've caused us much trouble, but all will be forgiven soon enough. You will understand, in the end, that this is for the good of Siena." Giovanni glared at him, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his gut. "This isn't salvation. It's madness. You're condemning Siena to a fate worse than death." Lorenzo's smile was cold, almost pitying. "You're too blind to see it, Giovanni. You've always been too caught up in your science, your reason. But some things are beyond reason. Some things require faith and sacrifice." Giovanni clenched his teeth, his mind racing. He had to act quickly, before they began the ritual. He glanced around the chamber, his eyes scanning the walls, the ceiling, the narrow passageways that branched off into the darkness. There had to be a weak point, a place where the structure could be brought down. Then he saw it. A section of the ceiling near one of the passageways had a crack running through it, the stone looking brittle and unstable. If he could somehow trigger a collapse there, it might bring down the entire chamber. But how? He looked down at his bindings, the rough rope digging into his skin. He needed his hands free. He shifted his weight subtly, testing the strength of the ropes, trying to find a weakness. The cloaked men stood silently around him, their attention focused on Lorenzo and the preparations for the ritual. If he could just distract them long enough. Lorenzo turned his back to Giovanni, walking toward the altar. "Bring him forward," he commanded. The men began to pull Giovanni toward the center of the chamber, toward the blood-stained altar, but in that moment, Giovanni saw his chance. He twisted sharply, wrenching his body away from their grip. The sudden movement startled them, and for a brief second, their hold on him loosened just enough. Giovanni threw himself to the side, slamming his shoulder into one of the cloaked men, knocking him off balance. With a grunt of effort, Giovanni pulled his wrists apart, feeling the rope strain and then, blessedly, snap. His hands were free. He didn't waste a second. Giovanni sprinted toward the cracked section of the ceiling, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear Lorenzo shouting behind him, the sound of footsteps closing in on him. But he couldn't stop, not now. Reaching the weakened wall, Giovanni grabbed a loose stone from the ground and slammed it into the crack with all his strength. The stone groaned under the pressure, dust and debris raining down around him. He hit it again and again, feeling the structure give way beneath his blows. The ceiling above him began to tremble, the cracks spreading like spider webs across the stone. Giovanni stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he watched the chamber begin to collapse. The ground shook violently, and the air was filled with the deafening sound of stone grinding against stone. The cloaked men shouted in panic, scrambling to escape as the ceiling caved in. Lorenzo's voice rose above the chaos, shouting commands that were quickly drowned out by the thunderous roar of the collapse. Giovanni could barely hear anything beyond the pounding of his own heart, the world around him reduced to dust and darkness. But he couldn't stop now. Giovanni turned and ran toward the passageway, the walls crumbling behind him. The floor beneath him cracked and shifted, sending him tumbling to the ground, but he pulled himself up, pushing through the pain, through the fear. He had to get out, had to escape before the entire catacomb came down on top of him. As he reached the passageway, the ceiling above him gave way completely, a massive slab of stone crashing down just inches behind him. Giovanni threw himself forward, barely avoiding being crushed by the falling debris. The passageway shook violently, but he kept moving, his lungs burning with every breath. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he burst out of the catacombs and into the open air. He collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. Behind him, the catacombs were nothing but rubble, a grave for the cult, for the dark force they had summoned, and for the horrors they had wrought upon Siena. The ritual was over. The bells of the cathedral began to toll in the distance, their sound carrying through the quiet streets. It was not the mournful toll of death Giovanni had grown so accustomed to. It was different now. It was the sound of hope. Giovanni lay there for a moment, staring up at the sky, letting the sound wash over him. He had done it. He had stopped them. Siena was free, at least for now. But deep down, he knew the darkness wasn't gone. It had only been buried. And one day, someone might dig it up again. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over the battered city of Siena. The streets were still quieter than they once had been, but the oppressive heaviness that had settled over the city during the worst days of the plague had begun to lift. The death toll had slowed, and while the scars left by the sickness would linger for years to come, there was a renewed sense of hope in the air, a hope that Giovanni had never thought he would see again. He stood at the edge of the piazza, looking out at the cathedral. Its towering spires were still covered in black flags, a reminder of the lives lost, but the bells that rang now carried a different tone, a tone of life returning. Giovanni had spent the last few days in a daze, his body sore and battered from the collapse of the catacombs, his mind still reeling from all that had happened. The catacombs now lay in ruins, buried beneath the rubble of the collapse he had triggered. Lorenzo, the cult, and the dark force they served were gone, destroyed by their own hubris and Giovanni's desperate gamble. Beside him, Beatrice stood in quiet contemplation, her hands folded together as she stared at the cathedral. Her face was still pale, but the deep sadness that had haunted her eyes was beginning to fade. She had been by Giovanni's side since the collapse, helping him tend to the remaining sick, offering solace to those who had lost loved ones. Her faith, shaken as it was, had not been broken. "Do you think it's truly over?" Beatrice asked quietly, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty. Giovanni sighed, his gaze fixed on the cathedral's spires. "It's over for now," he replied. "But the darkness, it will always be there, beneath the surface, waiting. We've buried it, but that doesn't mean it's gone." Beatrice nodded slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "And what of Siena?" she asked. "Will we ever truly be free of it?" Giovanni turned to her, his expression softening. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we've given Siena a chance to heal, to rebuild. And that's all we can do for now." She smiled faintly, her hand brushing against his arm. "You did it, Giovanni. You saved us." Giovanni shook his head, the weight of everything he had seen and done still heavy on his shoulders. "Not alone," he said softly. "None of this was done alone." They stood in silence for a few moments longer, the sound of the bells washing over them, a reminder that life would go on. The city would heal, as it always had, and Giovanni would continue his work, knowing that the darkness would never truly be gone, but that hope could always return. For now, that was enough. If you enjoyed unraveling this, you're in for another spine-tingling tale. Click the video on your screen to discover more eerie stories from the Phantom Story Society, where history's darkest secrets come to life. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Until next time, stay curious and beware of the shadows.